So today's lecture is entitled On Bridging the Different Classes of Epidemic Models, Insights and Policy Implications. So our speaker for today holds an Aboitiz Chair in Data Science at the Asian Institute of Management, where he is also a professor and the head of the Aboitiz School of Innovation, Technology and Entrepreneurship, or ASITE. Under ASITE is an advanced analytics industry-facing research laboratory, the Analytics, Computing, and Complex Systems, or Access Lab, where Chris is the executive managing director. Chris is a well published scientist, educator, and entrepreneur. Prior to joining AIM in 2017, he was a senior scientist at the Institute of High Performance Computing at the Agency for Science, Technology, and Research, or ASTAR, Singapore's lead government think tank for fostering world class scientific research. He was the scientific director of the Complex Systems Group, which led one of the major programs under A-STAR's Urban Systems Initiative. He has been leading multi-million dollar research and development projects with local and international businesses, multinational companies, and various government agencies in the Philippines and Singapore. Prior to his stint in Singapore, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Physics of Complex Systems in Dresden, Germany, and he obtained his PhD in physics from the National Institute of Physics, University of the Philippines, Diliman. So I'm really excited to hear about what Chris has to tell us today. So Chris, are you ready?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the very generous introduction, Kay. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Paase, for the invitation. As mentioned, the title of my presentation is on bridging different epidemic models, insights, and policy implications. Uh, there will be three parts of my presentation, but the main goal of this presentation is really threefold. The first one is to provide general information about COVID-19, which I'm sure if you have attended the previous PAASI seminars, this is already something that a good portion of you have a good understanding. But maybe I will be focusing more on the balance between this disease and the impact of this disease to the economy in the introduction. And one of the reason why we are doing this webinar, and this is, I think, the seventh time that I'm giving a presentation on different issues about COVID-19, but specifically for this presentation, since this is sponsored by scientists and engineers of Filipino descent, my goal really is to empower other modelers and to give tribute to a guy named Isaac Newton, who actually started this idea of modeling through differential equations. A good portion of the epidemic models that we are using now happened when he was actually confined during a plague in London in 1666. And finally, the goal of this talk is to provide an appreciation of data in terms of policy, planning, and education. So we have developed learning resources and learning materials, which we will be happy to share to those who would like to join the many modelers who are trying to understand this COVID-19. And if we still have time, I would like to add additional perspective and have a discussion on why I think we really need world-class scientists in the Philippines. And it becomes very obvious during this time of pandemic. So the main takeaways, at least the academic and hopefully the general takeaways of this presentation is I would like to show that as a cliche goes, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so is epidemic models. Okay, different epidemic models will tend to highlight a specific features of the system, and one approach can be more efficient compared to others at different times and in different assumptions. And the models that we are using have different purpose. So hopefully I will be able to emphasize on this thing during my presentation. So my presentation will be composed of three parts. The first part, as I mentioned, is a general view, a general look at COVID-19 as a pandemic, looking at the history and the news surrounding this one. The bulk of my presentation will be on the second part, where I will demonstrate how all models are somehow related. And it is actually by looking at the different assumptions where we can differentiate the applicability and usefulness of these different models. And finally, I will be looking at some insights and policy implications of modeling this COVID-19. Specifically, I will be discussing this so-called basic reproduction number, because most modelers are using this specific parameter to understand whether there will be an outbreak or there will be an extinction from this epidemic model, aside from the usual graphs that you are seeing. I will argue, and I think a good portion of the scientists will agree with me, that probably this variable, this basic reproduction number, is the most famous and the most famous flawed parameter in science. And I will be giving a perspective on what are the possible insights and policy implications if we combine this basic reproduction number with other information that we are getting now. And hopefully I can still find time to give a live forecasting demo about what we are experiencing now. So some basic history and news. Plague is something that happened before. In fact, one of the worst plague that we have experienced is that of the Black Death or bubonic plague, which is accounted for as something that is actually not viral. Unlike the one that we are experiencing now, which is virus and airborne, this is non-airborne, carried by fleas from rats. It is bacterial. It was shown to be bacterial. But during this time, the people don't still understand that being filthy actually translates to poor health. There is no theory of germs, and that only happens during the 1800s. This one resulted to a death of about 200 million, or one-third of the population. So during this time, there are about 400 to 600 million individuals. So that will be one-third to one-half of the population. And of course, some evolutionary scientists believe that this death is the reason for the Renaissance. No? But of course, that is something that is purely speculative. In the one that closely resembles what is happening now is something that happened in the 1900s, about 100 years ago, known as the Spanish flu. The only reason why it was referred to as Spanish flu is because Spain during that war, during the World War I, is one of the few countries who are actually neutral in Europe, and therefore most of the information, most of the channel of information are coming from Spain. But the origin of Spanish flu, the first reported case is actually in the US, in Kansas City, in March 11, 1918. Spanish flu closely resembles what we are experiencing now because, one, this is airborne. In fact, during October to December, a strain of virus coming from the so-called Spanish flu can kill an individual within hours or few days. US is one of the biggest, same as what we are seeing in the trend now. US is one of the country that is that is hit hardly by this virus, decreasing the average lifespan in the US in 1 year time to about 12 years. In overall, globally, the decrease in lifespan during this time is about 8 years. And it will take 22 years to develop a vaccine. And a proper understanding why this can kill within hours or few days only happened about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, in 2008. One of the critical component in preventing this is through the so-called vaccine, which was first discovered by Dr. Jenner when he realized that cowpox, milkmaids, who are exposed to cowpox as a weaker version of the smallpox, actually will not be impacted by smallpox, which implies that, as Friedrich Nietzsche mentioned, whatever, probably it's true that whatever will not kill you will make you stronger. And in general, that is the idea of vaccine. If you can create something that will prepare your antibody to fight a specific strain of virus, then probably your body has a better chance of surviving that virus. And again, in comparison with other flu, we can see here that almost every 10, 20 years, every generation, there will be a generally impactful strain that we will be seeing in our lifetime. In fact, in general, we've been seeing a lot of the so-called zoonotic virus. And the idea of zoonotic virus, of course, is that these are viruses that comes from animals, okay, and then eventually they spill over to human. And what has been shown is that the combined transmission to different animals before going to human, normally those are the strains that actually impact us the most. So if you try to compare by the numbers in the COVID-19 that we are experiencing now with the most recent viruses, okay, from 1967 up to today, you will see that probably after this COVID-19, the one that really impacted the world is that of H1N1. Okay, by note that the Spanish flu is actually a version of the swine flu or H1N1. And this H1N1 have in fact impacted already or affected already 214 countries and about 762 million population. The main difference why H1N1, the impact of H1N1 is not as pronounced as the impact of COVID-19 is because of the fatality rate. Right now, the fatality rate of COVID-19 stands globally at 6.93%. That is, there are 265,000 deaths out of the 3.8 million that has been infected. In comparison, the fatality rate of H1N1 is just 0.02%. So you are looking here at more than 350 times higher fatality rate compared to that of H1N1. But in terms of the number of countries affected, both has already affected about 210 plus countries. But the total number right now of the cases reported for COVID-19 is about 3.8 million. Now, if we look at the translation, assuming that we will have a 763 million cases of COVID-19, this will translate to about 53 million deaths, okay? Which, of course, hopefully that thing will not happen. I think the one of the game changer of this specific virus is when I saw that and I realized that this virus can be airborne, and in fact, the ability of this virus to stay airborne is way higher or stronger compared to that of H1N1. I saw this article which was archived then March 14, 2020, and it's a very simple article actually. Simply looking at how long can this COVID-19 stay in air or in surfaces. And it's a very straightforward experiment. I look at the authors, realize that these are credible authors, some of the top guys working on this space in epidemic. And I feel that after seeing this and noting that the fatality can be very high for this virus, I think that this is a game changer, that we probably will have a new normal during that time. And indeed, a pandemic was called after I've seen this specific article. So the article simply looks at how long the coronavirus can live on surfaces and on air. And it was shown that this one can be airborne for 3 hours compared to that Spanish flu, where the estimate is that it can only stay in air for less than an hour. Note that the idea of social distancing is only to prevent a virus from being contagious when one is breathing. When somebody is sneezes, okay, and MIT studies have shown that it can go all the way to 200 feet. That is about 18 meters. and social distancing, if you are not protected, will not even be useful for such. It has also been shown that for not very smooth surfaces like copper and cardboard, it can stay all the way to 24 hours. But for smooth surfaces like steel or plastic, the virus can stay all the way to 3 days. And if you compare this again with H1N1, you can see here that the main difference, as I mentioned, is the fatality rate. Okay, and yes, I'm compared to that of H1N1, which has impacted 762 million. So far, we only have 3.8 million. And the most important reason, again, why we are seeing this number is because the government and the people and the different countries are reacting because of this high fatality rate. While for that of H1N1, note that the fatality rate is similar to that of a common flu. Another stark difference is that the fatality rate of H1N1 seems to be relatively uniform. While that of so right now there are about 10% 65 years and older, and the deaths in H1N1 seems to be distributed all throughout the different range, while for that of COVID-19, most of the deaths are for those old individuals, 65 and above. And again, as I mentioned, if you simply look at the ability of these two viruses to stay on the surface and air, COVID-19 is actually more contagious compared to that of H1N1. In comparison with Spanish flu, the total number of cases, okay, during the 1918 Spanish flu, also referred to as a forgotten pandemic, simply because if you try, they refer to this as forgotten pandemic because there are more deaths during the wars, especially on the Second World War, compared to the Spanish flu. I think the total number of those who died in the Second World War is about 75 million, 1 million in the Philippines when we have 10.3 million population. Whereas this one, the total number is about 40 to 50 million, but that is very significant, okay, given the fact that during that time there are about 1.6 to 1.8 billion population. And in 1918, it was their estimate is that almost everyone was impacted by Spanish flu. Right now, the total number of cases reported is 3.8 million, but results indicates that we are highly underestimating this number. Okay, for example, if you try to look at a survey, run a survey by creating a sampling of testing in different states, have shown that at the minimum, okay, we are actually underestimating this virus by a factor of 10. So in New York, the actual number when the test was when the sampling was conducted, it's about just 200,000. But then they realized that there could be about 1/4 of the population, or about 2.2 million, actually impacted by this virus. And a similar test was done here in the Philippines, in Sampaloc and in Tondo, and I probably will discuss that later. But I'm surprised that they're not panicking because the underestimation is way higher in that experiment. It seems to me, my impression is, maybe I'm wrong, that the underestimation is about up to 750 times compared to the actual number of counts reported. Again, similar to H1N1, Spanish flu deaths are across all groups, while that of COVID-19 occurs within 65 years and above. And for Spanish flu, the vaccine was developed 22 years after. None was developed for COVID-19 to date. According to Bill Gates, typical development of a vaccine right now is about 5 years. And according to some experts, epidemiologists, etc., it will be a moonshot or suntok sa buwan to have a COVID-19 develop, a vaccine for COVID-19 developed within a span of 12 to 18 months. Early forecast, okay, one of the world leader who taken this virus seriously at the onset is that of Chancellor Merkel, whom I imagine most of the most of the participants in this webinar are quite aware that he has actually a PhD in quantum chem. He projected that up to 70% of Germany could become infected. In comparison, world leaders from other countries, from Italy, even UK, the Prime Minister of UK, and of course Trump, initially downplayed the impact of this virus, but eventually through the scientists of the government mentioned that actually the goals or the best scenario, and this is this is stark contrast of changing the narrative of the US government from downplaying the scenario to imagining that the goals or the best scenario is that there will be 100 to 240,000 deaths, shows that many actually world leaders are actually not prepared to treat this kind of war, to be in this type of war. So to date, the total number of cases in the US is number 1 in the world, and also the total number of deaths, where the total number of recorded deaths as of last night is about, last night here in the Philippines is about 74,000 deaths. The initial estimate of the group of Neil Ferguson and the other epidemiologists at Imperial College in London is that almost everyone will be infected, and they base this again on the experience that we have with the Spanish flu. In 1918, almost everyone was infected, but note that during that time, only few thousands actually traveled by air. Okay, the first commercial flight happened in 1914, and a commercial flight can only accommodate 14 to 20 passengers, and you have to reserve your seat 16 weeks before. Okay, in comparison, the projected number of passengers for 2020 will be about 4.8 billion, or essentially about 70% of the total population. So, their projection is that almost everyone will be infected, but the difference is that they feel that the fatality rate is way lower than actually what we are observing now. They put the fatality rate at around 0.5%. Hence, their projection is that only 40 million deaths with this number. No? But what we are seeing now is the total number of infected is way lower than 7 billion, and the number of deaths is, of course, way lower than 40 million so far. So as a result of this pandemic, half of the world is in lockdown. Okay, about 3.9 million of people are currently in their homes due to coronavirus. A lot of psychological concern because of this. Domestic violence is expected to soar by 20% during lockdown. So this is another repercussion of this virus. And it has changed education forever. Right now, about 1.2 billion students across 186 countries are out of the classroom. And since a good portion of the people in this webinar are educators, I think this is worthy of discussion and worthy of another webinar. Well, how will this pandemic impact our education as a result? And global loss, okay, estimated nearly half of the global workforce, 1.6 billion, especially in the informal sector, is at risk of job loss, losing their jobs. And the forecast of the UN-based ILO is that the full-time job loss will be up to more than 300 million. And notice how they are changing this forecast. In March 18, they put the number 25 million. When a US think tank Fed of St. Louis said that US alone will have about 47 million job loss. They changed the estimate to 100 million on April 8, 2 weeks later, and another 2 weeks, they move it to 305 million job losses. So just to show you the impact of the COVID-19's community quarantine to job losses, you will see here, this is the first 2 weeks, March 15 to 21, when the US started to take note of the impact of this virus. First 2 weeks and 10 million jobs were lost. And note that this is definitely way higher than any of the other crises that the US have been have experienced. So like the financial crisis and different recession. And to date, about 33.5 33.5 million claim requested for claims in the US. The estimate is 47 million. Okay, so maybe there are still 14 million, but 33.5 already claimed, and the number of claims every week is about 3 million. Okay, it's stabilized to roughly about 3 million. Actually, it has not stabilized. It's going down. But last week, it's about 3.3 million, additional 3.3 million, 3.2 million. Now, the impact of this to SMEs is quite high, as 50% of the small businesses have a buffer of less than 1 month. Okay, so in the interest of time, I will not discuss this, but just to provide a perspective, in the Philippines setting, more than 99, actually, it's about 90, roughly more than 99% in the Philippines are considered to be micro, small, and medium enterprises. And the buffer, their cash buffer is definitely way less than 1 month for most of this. And when they look at the jobs that are most vulnerable during the COVID-19 pandemic, education comes out as one of those that are highly vulnerable. And of course, low-wage earners is more vulnerable than high-wage earners. But I would like to focus on education, since the expected number of jobs that will be lost in the US in education is about 3.7 million. Note that this is roughly 90% of educational services in the US that is not linked to the government. In contrast, we have about 500,000 individuals which falls in the same category in the Philippines, private education institutions. So the forecast for the Philippines, initially the forecast of ILO is 30,000 to 60,000. Again, they have increased this by more than threefold to date. And the forecast of NEDA and that of ADB we will be losing jobs up to 2.5 million, okay, as a result of COVID-19. And you will see how the narrative is changing as similar to the US. The government of the Philippines initially downplayed the impact of this one. And in fact, the initial projection for the impact of this to the economy is quite marginal. Okay, from the expected 6%, 6+% GDP, they said that maybe we will go to 5.5 to 6.5%. And then they have revised this 2 weeks later, putting the GDP projection from minus 0.6 to 4.3%. Okay, if we lose 6% roughly, that translates to about 1 trillion of GDP loss, since the total GDP of the Philippines is about 17 trillion or about $350 billion. We received our GDP first quarter yesterday, and the number was put at 0.2%. Okay, from the previously forecasted 6.2%. And note that this is just 2 of the 13 weeks community quarantine. So we expect that the second quarter GDP will be way worse, and definitely we will be in recession. Recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of being in the negative. And to date, even if we leave the May 15 community quarantine, you are looking at about 6 weeks already in the second quarter. So my personal expectation that we will go into negative 5% of GDP for the second quarter. So these are the most impacted sectors in the Philippines, tourism. And exactly that is the reason why the 27.51 stimulus fund was initially, a good portion of which, about 14 billion of the 27.1 billion, was given to the tourism, because the job loss in this sector is one of the highest in the Philippines. We have about 6.5 million employed essentially because of tourism, and 30% of that will translate to about 2 million job loss. Trade, and those who are in the trade and import-export industry, almost everyone will be compromised. OFW remittances, so far 230,000 already filed for support. So we are looking at a minimum of 10% potential job loss. And again, going back to education, private education, especially those of the tertiary education, note that this is a third whammy already for the private tertiary education. The first one is when we have imposed that there will be K to 12. So for 2 years, freshman and sophomore years in college, they don't have so many students. Second is when there is a pre-tuition act, which causes most students to enroll in the public institution, not the private institution. And of course, this is the third component. Even the opening in August, which most probably August 24, which was announced by DepEd, this already means losing 55.2 billion for many of these institutions. And a good portion of the college universities that are privately owned, that are small, not in the size of Ateneo or LaSalle, will probably have a problems with regards to their liquidity. Some silver lining, okay? So I'm sorry that I spent more time on this one. We have been seeing cleaner water, cleaner air. In fact, the NO2 NO2 in China has been drastically decreased as a result of COVID-19, and they are mentioning that they have seen the blue skies for the first time. And because of less consumption of fuel, this might impact climate change or decrease global warming. We are seeing in the Philippines now a faster transitioning to digital currency. About roughly we have 90% unbanked. And this transitioning to digital currency might make our economy more inclusive and more agile. And there are a lot of articles attributing cancer diseases to progress more faster because of pollution. And now we are seeing less pollution. The particulates, for example, in EDSA here, which is typically stands at about 199, is now down to 40 to 50, which is almost similar to the air that you will breathe in if you're staying in Singapore. Okay, now let me proceed in the next 10-15 minutes to the idea of bridging the different epidemic models. And specifically, I will be looking at how the different models, that of exponential logistics, SEIR, SIRX, actually are all in can be classified and can be used in different contexts. And it's just important to note that in honor of Sir Isaac Newton, probably one thing that I will do here is to give you a perspective of how these models are actually being formulated. Calculus was discovered independently by Leibniz in 1966. Sorry, 1666. It's not 1966, 1666. When Isaac Newton was actually isolated during the Great Plague of London. 1666 is Newton's Annus Mirabilis, wonder years, where during that time he developed calculus and of course Leibniz independently, some theory of optics, geometrical optics, and discovered the universal law of gravitation, which we have now associated as that of the comparison between Apple and the moon. And I think it's poetic that 355 years later, we will be using the mathematics that he developed to fight another and to understand again a pandemic. Yeah. So just to give a general perspective about how do you model or write equations for epidemic models, it is generally conceptual. It is something that can be very intuitive. The main idea is that susceptible will be converted into the infected population through some level of transmissivity. So this transmissivity is very much dependent on how many of the susceptible are actually exposed to that of the infected population. And the formula is simply given by, this transition is simply given by beta, the transmissivity rate, multiplied by SNI. And the general idea of formulating this through differential equation is every time you have an an arrow that is going outside from S, for example, that will be negative. So that's the reason why you are seeing the negative signature here. And this is just the rate, okay? This is just the rate of how many of the susceptible eventually, what is the increase in the number of susceptible, and it's negative because the susceptible becomes infected. So this is a simple SI model. And if you look for the formula for the I model, if the arrow is going to the I, for example, notice that instead of the negative, you have a positive. So this is the simple expression for the SI model. And of course, noting the conservation constraints that the population is in general, the total of which should be conserved, then S plus I is equivalent to 1, where S is, of course, the total number of actual susceptible divided by the number of susceptible population. So, yes, so the general idea is given by that graph. And if you will go and use, for example, the SIR model, again, the formulation is the same. Okay, the general idea is the same. If there is an arrow going outside, say, the susceptible becoming infected, and infected becoming recovered, an outward arrow will mean negative. Okay, an inward arrow will mean positive. So you can see that the impact of this is positive here. So the impact of this component to I is positive, while the impact of those who are recovering is negative. Now, you will ask, how come this is a product of S and I while this one is just I? The reason for such is because, of course, if you will look at the number of infected who will recover, that is only proportional to the number of people who are infected. But if you will look at the number of people who are infected, okay, that is proportional to both the number of people who are susceptible and the number of people who are already infected. So the more people who are infected and the more people who are susceptible, the higher will be the number of the infected individuals. But bottom line is, as long as you can draw this diagram, it will be, in general, at least into those who understand calculus, very straightforward to look into this rate equation. So this is the most basic and the most standard model in looking at the epidemic, known as the SIR model, susceptible, infected, and the recovered model. And of course, you have the conservation principle. You can create different models. You can say, for example, introduce the idea of expose, and the first step is to write this diagram. And once you have written this diagram, it will be straightforward to write the equations. Arrows going forward will mean positive. Arrows going outward will mean negative. Notice that in the expression that I'm showing here, it assumes that maybe there are some that we can recover because of vaccination. So this is the so-called SEIR model. Okay, now from this model, okay, two of the things that we have observed and two of the things that we've heard are the term exponentials and logistics. The first thing that you will see actually during the initial phase of the epidemic is that of an exponential growth. Why do we see this? Okay, and why is curve fitting using exponential a valid modeling concept? Actually, we can easily see that exponential is the first approximation to SIR model when you have not much infected individuals. So if you simply look at this component of the equation in your I equation, and noting that at the onset, when you are at the onset, most of the people are susceptible because there are not too many infected yet, then you can approximate this component here, this S here, by some S naught and approximate that this S naught is about 1. And as a result, you will have this expression di dt is equal to B minus gamma I. And the solution for this, okay, to those who've taken up calculus, is actually an exponential. And in fact, it is during this time when we can clearly estimate the so-called basic reproduction number, which is simply equivalent to the ratio of the effective transmission rate of the virus divided by the recovery rate of the virus. And as long as this is greater than 1, you will see that this exponential term here will be positive, which means it can grow exponentially. If it is less than 1, then this will be negative, which means it will die down. So this is exactly the reason why, so the exponential in linear plot will look like this, but in log linear plot, where most of the other plots as shown, is being shown, will be a straight line. So the reason why it is being shown in the log linear plot is because an exponential will look like a straight line in the log linear plot. So it's easier to understand and see that indeed it is an exponential curve. So again, most of the countries in the world have shown exponential growth, especially in their first 2 weeks. So this is something that we have plotted. And you can see that in 14 days, okay, exponential is generally non-intuitive. It's very much dependent on the number of infected cases. For example, one infected cases in 14 days will infect 128 per day. If you have a doubling of 2 days, if it is exponential, while 30 days later, it can have an impact 32,768. Okay, 2 orders of magnitude greater than that of which that happened in 14 days. So notice that the first 1 to 15, you have only 128 for an exponential curve. 15 to 30, you will eventually explode to this number. So this is generally not intuitive to us. And if you look at, again, the trend of almost all countries, you will see that, again, first 2 weeks, you will have an exponential growth. It's doubling every 2 to 3 days. And this is, again, the data from the US, where I plotted the deaths and at the same time the confirmed cases. And you can see that both the deaths and the confirmed cases follow this exponential in the first few weeks. So I will skip this component, skip this part. And logistic equations happens when most of the susceptible, there are more when you imagine that those who are recovering is way lower compared to that of the number of infected individuals. If the number of infected individuals is way higher than that of the number of people who are recovering, which is true, especially when you recovered way faster than when the people have not yet recovered and there are a lot of infected cases, but you have already flattened the curve, you will immediately see the idea of the logistic equation. And again, from the SIR or the SI model, the ability to see this logistics expression is by simply looking at this equation. If you try to solve this, the solution to this will be given by this curve known as a sigmoid. And if you try to plot it, it will look like this one. So we have seen this curve, for example, in Korea, South Korea, and in China. But one of the things that you can see in their curves is that in South Korea, at least initially, they peak 2 weeks later and 1 month, roughly twice of that before it flattens. And for China, the length of time is actually double or twice of such. So key takeaways before I proceed to the last part of my presentation. Well, this is, of course, a very biased statement. Math is beautiful, and curve fitting using exponential at the onset and logistics when curve is flattened are epidemic curves expected in almost all the model. Okay, SIR, SEIR, the most recent SIRX and other models. Now, the problem with using exponential is that it will not hold for longer times. And the problem with logistics is that it assumes that you need longer data for it to be useful, which is they are complementary to each other. But if you would like to see the most general trend, you may want to look at and use the other set of models such as SIR and SEIR. We have developed learning resources compiled as an interactive notebook for these different cases, and I will be happy to share with you these notebooks. These notebooks includes, in fact, exercises to make sure that you understand the context of all the equations that you will be using. So it's curve fitting. You can do your SIR, SEIR modeling in this notebook, including trying to replicate those that you are observing about the basic reproduction numbers that are being tracked. So just to give you an idea, one of the most important things that you need to understand every time you use a model is to understand the assumption. Okay, the assumption of the SIR model includes constant population size, meaning the population size is not expanding or decreasing. So this model will not be accurate if you will try to model the transition from quarantine to non-quarantine stage. Constant rate, you are assuming transmission and removal rates are generally constant. No change in demography, no births and deaths, and the population is homogeneous or generally well mixed. So in the notebook that I send, this is essentially the code that you need to use if you would like to implement this model. This is a code in Python. You can have this in the notebook that I will be happy to share. And you will see all these curves. Okay, if you implement this component, you will see the curve of how the susceptible decreases, how the number of people who are recovering increases, and of course, the total number of infected individuals at any point in time. So for example, for South Korea, if you try to optimize these parameters, okay, looking at the data immediately and unbiasedly try to look what are the values of these parameters. This is the code to optimize that. And notice that all models will involve some sort of curve fitting. This is for Korea. So automatically, you will be able to derive the effective transmissivity, the recovery rate, and consequently R0, which is just beta over alpha here. Beta over alpha. So the effective transmissivity divided by the recovery rate. And these are actual data from that of South Korea. Or for China, these are actual data for China, and you can see what is the value of R0, beta, alpha, etc. But maybe just to sum up this component, two important insights that you will see from all these models. If your intervention happens before the peak, there will be a significant decrease in the number of cases. In fact, what we are seeing in the Philippines seems to be, because of the intervention, seems to be this red line. And this red line will mean that at some point, the confirmed infected cases will be somehow flat. And therefore, if you try to look at the cumulative confirmed cases, you will see a straight line. So our aggressive quarantining of the population actually resulted to this. So we were able to prevent the blue curve from happening. But if the intervention happens after the peak, there will be a marginal decrease in the number of cases. So that means you don't need to really intervene, just allow what is the current process that is happening, whether it's social distancing or community quarantine, and you don't need to further intervene. It will naturally decay already. So intervention, the time of intervention is very critical if we want to reduce the casualty. This is the projection for the Philippine case. And note that dependent on how you actually play around with the different parameters, you will see different curves. Okay, you will see different curves. You will see different time when it will peak from March 2020 to mid-May, etc. It can go all the way to June, July. And flattening can happen twice that time. And it's essentially, it is simply because of these different assumptions, while we are seeing different projections from different groups in the Philippines. So it ranges from 140,000 all the way to actually, I look again at the work done by PIDS, and the projection can be up to 70% of the population. So that is actually not 29 million, but up to 70 million of the population. And the peak time can be as early as April, which we now, based on the data that we have, seems to be not the case, all the way to September 2022. So again, assumptions are very critical. And it is because of these different assumptions that resulted to these different models. For example, if you try to look at how the group from PIDS model it, they simply plug in the total population, which is 109 million as the number of susceptible, and simply look at the impact of the curve. But actually, the total number of susceptible population is always way lower than the total population. So the conclusion that we can derive here is none. But even if you try to look at the result provided by different or the different groups in the Philippine context, for example, this is the prediction of they call Singaporean AI. This is actually a work done by the SUTD group, published about a week ago. They are projecting that by in the next 4 days, actually, we will end 97% of the COVID-19 situation in the Philippines. But we now know that this is wrong. We look at the current data. I'm imposing here the current data. This is the current data. So you will see that we are not seeing that end on in the next 4 days. And in fact, what I will show maybe in the live forecasting demo is that when you do normalize the number of cases coming from the different states, it seems that the second wave that we are seeing now is actually originating not from Metro Manila, but from the Region 7 or the Central Visayas region or Cebu specifically. So final statement, you can, of course, use SEIR model, at least in terms of implementing this. It's as straightforward as SIR model. All you need to do is, if at least using code, which we have presented in that notebook, all you have to do is to play around with the component here. And what you will see is that dependent on the model that you use, you will get a different set of parameters. So what is very important then is to put these things in context. Okay, if you will be using SIR model, do not use SEI model to make a prediction. If you will be using SEIR model, do not make SIR model to make a forecast. And it is very important that you understand the parameters here. For example, the recovery rate is a parameter that we can actually measure. This is the number of infected cases that we are recovering. But the problem with the recovery rate is that if you assume that the data that we are seeing is actually not underestimating, then you will be seeing that in the recovery rate error. So, for example, New York case, if the actual data that you are simply seeing is then those who recovered that are actually have shown problems because of the coronavirus, and those that are asymptomatic, those who are asymptomatic, you've not included them in the equation that they actually recovered, then you will be missing a lot of factor with respect to the expression for the recovery rate constant. And there is an epidemic model for every occasion. Again, the basic of SIR, you can play around with the different dynamics of the SIR model, that some of the infected can be eventually be susceptible again, that some of the infected can recover and then become susceptible again. You can play around with this. But what we have learned in the previous equation is that good model will always translate to good prediction. And normally we get good prediction if we have good data. And good data, unfortunately, happens when we have have a significant number of casualties. So we hope that mass testing will allow us to improve that data, and that is one of our advocacy. That's why I've written this column, this popular column in March 28, because during this time I'm just frustrated that most of the conversation, especially in the social media, is not really on mass testing, but pitting one politician over the other, like Vico Soto and President Duterte, when in fact, even US are panicking because the total number of tests that they can do is just 104,000 per day. During in March 17, the total number of per million tests that we have done in the Philippines is just 4.6. Vietnam have done 99, and to date, Vietnam has no deaths. Okay, no deaths confirmed. In fact, if you try to look at the cases reported per testing, Okay, even up to the first week of April, the number of cases that we have per testing is within 65%, 60 to 65%, which is highest at around 80+%. I think that is during April 5 or April 6. So if you try to compare this with countries like South Korea and Vietnam, the number of cases per PUI tested, notice that in April 6 to 7, ours is around 60 to 65%, when South Korea and Vietnam has just 3.75% and 0.5%. It has improved significantly 2 weeks later. Ours is down to 10.44%. This is the time when we say that we have started doing mass testing. And yes, last night, the total number is about 7.14%. That's still way lower than that of South Korea and Vietnam. So the impact of this, as you can see, it impacts a lot of things, including the possibility of getting false positives and false negatives. Notice that this is actually just the number of individuals that are positively tested. And the orange here is the number of individuals who've been tested. And this is very small compared to the number of individuals who've been tested. So this is in South Korea. But during this time, the total number that we are testing positive for every test that we are doing is within this range, okay, around 65%. So overall, our ranking in the world is about in the middle. Okay, overall, we are in the middle. My gold standard has always been Vietnam. The total cases in Vietnam per million is less than 3. And actually, their population is way older than us with almost 0 deaths. Okay, I'm not sure if I still have time, Kay.
Maybe another 5
okay.
minutes, yeah?
Okay, then.
So at least we
then.
can have time for the question and answer.
Okay, sorry for that.
It's okay.
I failed to approximate the
okay.
time I spent in the first 2 parts. So this is actually a quite important part where we are discussing reproduction numbers, since almost everyone, one of the things that they are looking at is the so-called RNAT, or the reproduction number, which is simply the expected number of secondary cases produced by a single infection. The reason why this is important is it gives us some idea or estimate on several things that some of which I will be discussing later. It is a threshold parameter that determines whether or not there will be an outbreak. Or it defines the number of people that you need to vaccinate so that you will be able to control the epidemic. It also determines the initial rate of increase of an epidemic, especially during its growth phase, and it determines the final size of the epidemic and the endemic equilibrium fraction. Okay, the number of population where you don't expect, if you have that number, you don't expect that it will exponentially grow. The system will exponentially grow. But caution is that I don't want everyone to interpret RNAT too much, simply because RNAT is not just a function of the properties of the virus. It is a combination of the properties of the virus and the way humans interact, which is not straightforward to understand. Getting RNAT, there are hundreds of ways that you can determine RNAT, and hundred of papers dedicated to this, understanding RNAT. And you will see that most those who are dealing with epidemics is that it's like some sort of a GDP in economics. It's actually arguably one of the most flawed parameter in science, but it's being used because there are no other alternatives. So you can compute for a changing RNAT. And just to give you a visualization of what we are expecting as a result of this RNAT, you can visit this webpage, www.complexity.asia, our site on this one, and you can see how this RNAT is changing, and also the possibility of outbreak, not just for the national data, but for every cities in the Philippines and every provinces in the Philippines. And just to give you an idea of what is the meaning of this, in the last last week actually, RNAT is roughly a little bit above 1. It is about 1.1, which means one case infects 1.1. And indeed, the meaning of this is you will see somehow a flattening of curve. But the new cases, especially during in the yesterday, are actually mostly from Region 7, 61% of which are actually from Region 7. If you try to normalize the data that you are getting from different regions, in fact, okay, you will see here that NCR, okay, this is normalization, which means the sum of the area under the curve of all these curves is equivalent to 1, so that I can just highlight the trend. The trend of the national in general follows that of the NCR. But if you try to look at the deviation recently of the trend in the national level and that of the NCR, you'll notice that this trend was the main difference is actually because of the increase in the number of cases being reported in Cebu, in Central Visayas region. So if you will be asking me about the second wave, what is the chance that we will have a second wave, a third wave, fourth wave? The answer to that is actually very straightforward. You can imagine that we already have 214 waves because there are 214 countries. No? So the level of granularity of the question about the waves will be dependent on how it's very much dependent on the resolution of that you'd like to understand. But what we are seeing now is that potentially the second wave, if you look at the national data, is simply because of the delay of the transmission to another areas or another place. I will be happy if we still have time. I will be happy to discuss about the different policy insights that we have written about this one. If not, I can send the notebook to those who are present in this audience. But I would like to end my presentation by noting that, again, we have to understand that a single trigger, this is started from a single infected cases, can always set up another exponential growth. Okay? Set up another exponential growth. And that is where the uncertainty of this virus lies. Because that exponential growth, if it translates to deaths, okay, can cause the government and the people to change their behavior. And as a result, because of this change of behavior, there will be a new set of models that we need to, or a new set of parameters that we need to use to incorporate in our model. And that is where the unpredictability of this result, the models that we are seeing right now. If you include the idea of reinfection, okay, it will make it more complex because right now, for example, the number of cases in Singapore is way higher than the initial pace that they observed. And there is a report in South Korea of reinfection, and I think the number that they are saying is that about 13% as a chance of being reinfected. Maybe some of the guys here can correct me. And I would like to end my slide by looking at what happened in Europe in the Spanish during the Spanish flu regime. Notice that the first wave that is considered from March to June 1918, the total number of casualties is not significant compared to that happened from October to December 1918, where most of the deaths actually came from. And the third wave, February to March 1919, a year later, where you will see another curve. To put this in context, let's look at the Philippine setting. This was captured by an article of F. Dialogo. I can find this in, this is from Ateneo, it is in the Ateneo library. He published this article, The Philippines in the World of Influenza Pandemic. And in the Philippines, at least, the first wave, the total number of deaths is 389, just 389. Of course, if we compare the Philippines then and the Philippines now, the total number of infected in the Philippines is said to be 4 million, which is about 40%. 40%. So all the numbers here, you can multiply by a factor of 10 for simplicity, because we have about 109 million population now. So that means if we will use the Spanish flu as a basis, it means that in the Philippines, 40 million could have been infected if it will have the same dynamics as that of the Spanish flu. The total number of deaths is reported to be, these are the confirmed deaths due to that pandemic, to be 90,000, which translates to about 1 million. if we will put it in today's number. The second wave is the killer. The second wave is the most lethal wave, where the total number of reported cases is about 86,000. The first wave, we only have 389 deaths then, and not much report on the impact on February to March 1919. But if you try to look at the deaths in the Philippines in 1917 to 1920, notice that in 1917, 212,000 deaths were reported. In 1920, 200,000 deaths were reported. But in 1918 and 1919, about 367,000 and 326 deaths. 326,000 deaths were reported, which means it's about 150,000 deaths every year additional. So the 90,000 deaths reported then might be an underestimation by a factor of 3 to 4. Okay, just for comparison, the total number of deaths resulting from World War II is about 75 to 80 million. And during that time, the total number of deaths in the Philippines is about 1 million. Well, far exceeding the deaths that resulted in this 1918 influenza. That is why Spanish flu is also known as the forgotten pandemic, because of the deaths of the Second World War, of the war. They feel that there are more deaths resulting from the World War compared to that of the Spanish influenza, or the Spanish flu. Sorry. So with this, I guess I will stop my presentation. Every one of you probably will have an appreciation of this, that the real end to this new normal is when we find a vaccine. Not even cure. Sorry, not even cure, but a vaccine. And the current approximation is that it will take us 12 to 18 months, according to Tara Smith and many other epidemiologists, before we can develop this. Average age, according to Bill Gates, is 5 years. But maybe we can shorten this to less than 6 to 9 months. In fact, first set of clinical trials are now ongoing across 72 laboratories around the globe. So with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was a very informative lecture, and I think you've really summed up a lot of information from the very basic and to the more detailed parts of modeling. Okay, so we have a few questions from our audience. So for those of you who have not yet seen the chat box, so if you go down your panel, you will see a chat function there. So if you have any questions or comments for clarification, please type in your questions. Okay, so we have the first one from Vince Daria. Considering that not all areas have the same rate of infections, are there models that target specific localized areas, for example, the Philippines, to predict their conditions, especially their readiness to open up and lift the quarantine conditions? Your assumptions are general, and how would you include terms in your equations to simulate local conditions such as population density, climate, industries, mode of transportation, lockdown or quarantine conditions, and perhaps our local governments can use these models to actually make decisions?
Thank you so much for that question, Vince. In fact, that is the part that I failed to present. And with your permission, can I share? Am I sharing now?
Yes, you're sharing the screen. Thank you.
So this is the screen that I have. I failed to share. The model that we implemented actually looks at every cities and every provinces in the country. And you can even forecast what is the impact of this to the health sector, the number of individuals that can be potentially impacted as a result of the local number of infected cases. So for those who are interested, you can visit the site that I've shown a while ago. So you can see here the regional results. You will be able to see there the potential of the trends in the different regions. Sorry, it's loading a little longer. Metro Manila cities. So you will see here the different cities in Metro Manila, the different provinces, the impact, the chance of the reproduction rate at different areas. Okay. But on the question of the policies, okay, so in this notebook, actually, we have provided here some of the very defined policies, including one that Vince mentioned. You have to consider the city or provincial level data. Do not wait for the probability of outbreak to be near zero in the national scale, because that will take forever. I believe that will take forever. And we have here a specific condition that we have approximated on when do you think you can lift the quarantine for a specific area. And bottom line is, it is not RT that is more important, but the number of confirmed cases in that specific area. You can in fact calculate exactly to some extent what is the chance that a specific area will have an outbreak probability based on the different expressions that are written here. On another note, okay, so I will skip this probably. I will go immediately to this last component. We have some articles actually written previously on the impact to the transport system of a model like an epidemic or a pandemic. So this was this appeared in Physical Review E and in a computer science conference. And here are some policy implications of SATS. For example, transportation limit is very important because it is where this is actually the bottleneck of most operations. In Metro Manila, you can in fact estimate if what is the impact of social distancing if we will make sure that the social distancing is measured without compromising the mobility of those who will be going to work. My estimate is that we should only allow 5 to 7% of the population to go back to work initially. 5 to 7% of the population in Metro Manila, because this will make sure that the quarantine, the social distancing protocol will be met. I've noticed that there is an article yesterday, 2 days ago, that the moment that we open up the workforce, you need to wait 3 to 4 hours in the MRT and in the bus before you can go to your work. That will translate to about 8 hours transport every day. I don't think that will work. I think what we can do is to look at the most important skeleton, and my initial estimate is that we can initially accommodate 5 to 7%, and based on that calibration, start increasing after which. Secondly, in terms of the network perspective, again, most of this is covered in some of our ideas shown in this site. One of the interesting component here is that all of this network that you are seeing here will also have an R0 equivalent to 2. R0 is equivalent to 2, which means the dynamics will be different dependent on whether you have super spreaders or whether the transmission is relatively homogeneous throughout the population. But one important conclusion that you can get from here is that it is important to understand the contact network of human mobility. Our result in an article that we have published 2 years ago, the contact network, one of the things that we should understand is how the different organizations, different jobs, for example, are interacting with respect to other jobs. And we can do the segregation based on such. But we have to be very careful on some groups, even though they are minority, who are actually dealing with all these groups. For example, in terms of the individuals whom we should prioritize in terms of testing, actually the grocery cashiers are higher spreaders compared to that of our so-called frontliners or health workers. The reason for that is because most of the people who will be interacting with our health workers are not that mobile, while that who will be going to groceries or those who will be interacting with those who goes to school or offices, they can spread the virus much faster. This is referred to as super spreaders. And one of the proposal that we are mentioning here is that for these super spreaders, we are recommending 3 to 4 days. Okay, this is to capture the early infectious rate of the virus. again, I will be happy to share this set of ideas that in the homogeneity, how do you create a heterogeneous population, etc. We'll be happy to share this set of policy implications to those who would like to have a copy. Thank you for that question, Vince.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, we have a follow-up question from Felino Lansigan, somewhat related to the first one. So if the SEIR or SIR models can be made maybe location-specific, what level of analysis should we actually be looking at? Should it be on a regional basis, provincial, or via LGUs?
Oh, well, yes, it can be made very specific. Again, the most important thing that we should understand in all those models, that the two parameters that we should actually input to those models will be the number of people who are susceptible and how many people are interacting with the other set of people. It can be very, very specific. My suggestion, because again, I think the problem that we are experiencing now is not just a health problem, but more so an economic problem. There will be deaths resulting from job loss and an economic loss as a result of this one. So I think it is more practical to do this based on, so for example, in Metro Manila, municipality based, because the mayor has a control on the issue at hand, and they can decide to close their borders. But if you will ask me, the more ideal, if we would like to look at this from the economic perspective, is by dividing the group based on their contribution to the economy, on how we can stay to be operational even if we can open this specific set of economy. Okay, this specific areas. So it could be because some of the areas are actually linked. Okay, there are places, for example, the industrial park in Laguna there are two connected industrial parks in Laguna, and maybe we can isolate those and create a mass testing in those so that we can understand and model more explicitly the epidemic model in that specific set of regions. So my short answer is you can make it very granular. Okay, you can make it very granular, SEIR and SER model, and you have to balance this with the number of testing that you can do. Because if you really would like this model to be accurate, one of my suggestions is do mass testing for maybe 5 real understanding of what is the actual situation on the ground. So if there will be less population in that specific area, or a more homogeneous population in that specific area, then that type of sampling will be more accurate. But you have to balance that with the size that you will be able to cover so that there will be more economic gain.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There's actually another follow-up question.
LGUs, but the problem is on the potential underestimation on the total number of cases that are being reported, and that greatly impacts the model. That greatly impacts how the parameters can be tuned in the model. Just to give you a concrete result, but I guess I have to validate and verify this, but this is my first reading on the presentation of Dr. Padilla regarding Metro Manila sampling. They did I think they did 850 random sampling in Sampaloc and Tondo, which has reported 40 cases with a 495,000 population. So if you divide that, 40 cases out of 495,000 population, that will be just 0.08% of the total population. They did random testing, and according to their results, rapid kit testing implies 3% recovered and 3% suspects. Okay, which translates to about 6% have been infected. That is my reading of the report. 6% versus 0.08%, that is a very huge discrepancy. And right now, we are just looking at one snapshot in time. notice that for the model to work, okay, for us to have a better understanding of the model, we should have several snapshots of time. My take is that at least we should have at least 5. And we should, to some extent, capture within the order of magnitude the total number of cases. Of course, we can make an estimate of how it is changing. But if you really would like to make sure that you will be able to separate those who've been infected or recovering from the general population, you should have an idea of how many people and where are they actually located. So this is where the mass testing is critical. This is where mass testing is very important for us to create a meaningful model. Because again, there's another model that was presented by the group of Bispignani, and one that is their model is again a variation of SIR, but different from the model that we are using now. The advantage of them is that they were able to do mobile tracing, mobile phone tracing of where the individuals are at any point in time. And I guess that is one thing that we have not done yet, okay, for the telco to potentially open up their the mobile the movement of the people. Of course, there will be concerns on data privacy, so it is very important that we find the proper balance on the data privacy issues and solving this pandemic that we have now.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from MLC. So you mentioned earlier on in your slides how long the virus typically lives on different types of surfaces. So how long does the virus live on cloth surfaces? Do you have information on that?
Cloth? I'm not
Cloth.
sure, but I'm not. I don't know really. But maybe some of the guys here will be able to answer. But my intuition on this one is that if it is a little rough, like that of most probably it will be within a day. Looking at the different items that I've shown there, the general idea is that if it's relatively smooth, it can stay there for a longer time.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take some questions from our YouTube channel. One's from Christina. You mentioned a while ago about super spreaders. Are delivery services part of these super spreaders? Can you consider them as super spreaders? Okay.
Definitely. Grocery workers, delivery workers, those who are interacting with a very mobile population, they are super spreaders. Bus conductors, these are super spreaders, yes. And note that if you actually try to assess which of this most probably is the type of spreading that we are seeing in the population, it is very difficult to sustain a spreading of this type of above a bifurcating spread. Chances are in most pandemic, the reason for the pandemic is because of the presence of super spreaders. That is why that is another interesting point that is known in network science theory. If you would like to do if you would like to immediately stop the propagation of this, you must be able to find the super spreading. And the way it is done, okay, at least in theory, is this. Tracing, essentially. The main idea is randomly, you choose an individual, check whether that individual is COVID-19 positive or not. If it is negative, forget about that individual. If it is positive, trace the individual who actually interact with that individual. And there is a very high chance that if you keep on doing this, tracing the one that is positive previously, you will hit the super spreader. And therefore, resources-wise, that is more efficient than randomly quarantining the population. This is known as a friendship paradox, no, or friendship paradox in network theory. The chance that you have your friends has more friends than you, or that your co-author has more published articles or more citations than you. Super spreaders can be we can trace that super spreaders by doing some targeted testing, random testing initially, and then keeps on tracing until you will go into the super spreader.
Okay, thank you for that, Chris. We have a question from Rodel Garcia. What is the projected impact of lifting the quarantine by May 15?
Thank you for that, Rodel. Rodel used to be the Chief Technology Officer of Globe and that of Manila Water. And he's a mathematician. Projected impact of May 15 quarantine. Again, I can only speculate. Okay, I can only speculate. But if I think it is important for us to uh, have a data on what will happen once the quarantine is lifted. To what extent will our behavior change compared to post-quarantine, compared to the current time where we are being quarantined. And that is the time when we have to do a lot of mass testing every other few days so that we will have an understanding of the impact of this virus. Okay, the how will this actually impact us? My but if we look at the history, during the Spanish flu, they have done community quarantine during March, April, and May. And what happened after which is that they go back to their previous behavior. In fact, they become more, according to some accounts, uh, they become more. Uh, they do, eventually they hug more, and as a result, you have the second wave, which is a combination of two things. That is why the second wave in Spanish flu becomes stronger, because it synchronizes with the annual flu, and at the same time the transmission rate actually becomes faster than the strain, the strain mutated, and actually it becomes more lethal compared to the first one. So there are a lot of things that we could only speculate, including whether the virus will try to survive. Okay, and if there is a mutation as a result of the dynamics that we are experiencing now, the impact will be different. Uh, if our behavior changes drastically compared to the pre-quarantine, which means we are more disciplined, then it is possible actually that we will be able to improve on our situation. So my short answer is there is a lot of uncertainty. I can only speculate. If we look at the data that we have on hand, if we look at the history, if we look at the Spanish flu, the projection is not very good. But hopefully we have learned from that history. We will be more disciplined this time around. And the most important thing, I think, personally, is that once the quarantine is lifted, the government must do mass testing immediately so that we will have more data to base upon our next moves. Because again, the data that we have now, we can only also speculate on what is the best model that we can use.
Okay, thank you, Chris. One from Vic Ilag. What is the empirical evidence showing that keeping distance between a susceptible and infected individual will reduce the rate of infection by a certain percentage? It doesn't seem to be included in the models, or are they? Or are these assumptions?
Well, the main component there that looks at the effective transmissibility is beta. The effective transmissibility rate accounts for the chance that you will be infected as a function of your contact with an individual. And we know that breathing, the 1 meter distancing actually is an approximation that you will not be able to, the virus will not be able to reach your face or mouth within a 1 meter distance. We have increased this to 2 meters. But again, MIT studies have shown that if you sneeze, the virus can be, the projectile of this virus can go all the way to 200 feet or about 18 meters. So social distancing in that case will not be useful. Secondly, the chance of you touching another person is higher if you are closer. Okay, if you are closer. So we touch our face 20 times in an hour. So if you touch an individual who is infected and who has some maybe remnants of the virus on some parts of their body, then the chance that you will put that in your eyes, in the open parts of your body, in your eyes, in your nose, etc., will be higher. But again, all these parameters, including the chance that it can be present in the grocery, that it can stay in the air in an MRT, etc., are speculative. And in the model, they are all captured by, at least in the SIR model or SEIR model, they are captured by the parameter Veta, which is, again, the effective transmission rate.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We'll take one question from the YouTube. So it's from Muhammad Aminulya. Would an island-based measurement be better compared to the current national measurement? Will the island-based measurement increase the accuracy of the model? And then he has another question. According to DOH, we are seeing the flattening of the curve. Is this verified based on the data and model? Yeah, please give your comments.
I don't know. I don't know about the first part, Ireland measurement. I'm not familiar about the Ireland measurement. On the second component, what we are seeing is that we are flattening the peak. So my take is this. Okay, my take is this. We are doing more tests now compared to last week and compared to the previous week, and the mere fact that the confirmed cases are still flat, it probably implies that we are decreasing the total cases nationwide in general. But I feel that we are very much underestimating, okay? Very much underestimating, because those who are asymptomatic, they will not go for testing. And unless we force them through a random sampling, no? Through a random sampling. So are we flattening the curve? What is obvious to me is that Metro Manila alone, if you look at the Metro Manila cases, it seems that it's not increasing now much from Metro. Looking at NCR, in fact, NCR's reproductive number is now at around 0.8, less than 1. No, and the increase in RT in the national setting is actually contributed by the different other provinces, especially Cebu. So one of the most important policy implication of this one, in my opinion, is something that I have stated a while ago. The quarantine should be per area. I don't know whether that will be per municipality, per LGU, per barangay, or per an economic zone. But we don't wait for the national number to decrease.
Okay, thank you for that, Chris. Another question from Kevin. Would it be possible to create a matrix to bridge the health impact and the economic impact? Or are there already existing models or designs for this?
Well, we have some work on this one, but you can also look at the work done by the UP COVID response team, where they have looked at the number of available beds in different areas, and they made some projection of what will be the impact to health, or the number of ICUs and even critically severe patients once we lift the quarantine. Again, as with all the other models, though, they take all these models with imagine that there are some speculations, but those are better speculations than none at all. With respect to incorporating the economic condition specifically, because again, the projection is that we will be losing every week. Okay, just to give you a perspective, the total GDP of the Philippines every week is about 350 billion pesos. Okay, 350 billion pesos. And I think this should be balanced properly with the impact of the quarantine. Because if we will continue to have it's obvious that we will be going into recession to me because of the if we compare this to the first quarter GDP figure, but there could be a lot of losses also resulting from job loss, not being able to treat the other diseases that you have because of economic concerns. So yeah, I can only speculate, but then there are economic models regarding this one, but not to the extent that you will actually have an exact measurement of what will be the impact of that for a specific area or a specific region. We hope we can work on this one. Okay, we hope we can work on this one. We have now the census data. We know how much is being paid by every municipality and how much of this can be used for health concerns, etc. Maybe we can include that with the probability of outbreak of opening, and then maybe we can have a better economic model for such.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Our next question comes from May Lim. So her first question is, what corrections are made to the model to account that the cases and deaths are not reported in real time? There is a lag, and it has varied from same day to more than a month. So this is very much related also to a question we have on YouTube from Pamela Resurrection on how the models actually record the positive cases, or how are they integrated into the model, and if this particular lag affects the results of your predictions.
Yes, thank you for that question, May. So the computation for the reproductive number here that you are seeing prior to the computation of this R, we do a windowing of 1 week. Okay, we do a windowing of 1 week, and it serves two purpose. Okay, the reason why we do windowing, the typical computation for R, the reproductive number, for example, or the models, uses the everything as a baseline from the day 1 all the way to day n. But by doing a windowing or looking at the running averages instead of looking at the exact number at any point in time, you will be able to take into account on the potential lags. But there is, of course, an additional assumption there that you are looking at 7 days as a good estimate of the averaging process. So for example, we thought that there's a recorded in March 31. If you're looking at my screen now, this is the confirmed cases here is 530, and everyone looks at this as the peak of the actual confirmed cases in the Philippine context. But notice that the only reason, probably in response to the question of May Lim, most probably the reason for such is simply because you have underreported on March 30, where you only have 119. What we've done actually, even in our predictions of RNAT, is actually to do an averaging every 7 days. Hopefully that will take into account the recovery rate.
Okay, thank you. She actually has a second question. For Region 7 or in Cebu City, they're catching a lot of cases due to the rapid test kit or mass testing. Yeah. The positives are subsequently verified via PCR, thus getting listed it in the DOH list. Would you know the coverage of rapid testing for the National Capital Region?
I don't know, actually. Well, I have I don't know. I'm looking at this data. I'm actually confused too. I don't know. But one thing that is important to note here is that if you will look at the false positives and false negatives being reported, it is very much dependent on this is a Bayesian idea, Bayesian estimate. We will be getting a lot of false positives if we don't have mass testing. So note that if the total number of confirmed cases with respect to the number of testing is very low, okay, is very low, then you will be biasing your testing to those with negative results, which means, okay, if we do a lot of testing, negative will be definitely negative. Okay, negative will definitely be negative. This is based on Bayesian statistics. And therefore, we can remove the number of, we can immediately, even if you are using rapid testing, which has a relatively lower specificity compared to the usual PCR testing, it will impact your ability to uh, immediately classify those who are actually will not be positive. So the negatives, those who are tested negative, even if it is rapid testing, if we have a lot of testing, will definitely be negative. So at least that is one reason why you would like to do, another reason why you would like to do mass testing. But on the question of the rapid testing in Cebu and that of in Metro Manila, I'm not sure. But what I know though is that there are a lot of organizations, there are a lot of companies who will conduct the same sampling testing that was done in Tondo in Manila. It was done in New York, in Santa Clara, to check whether the areas where they are operating, okay, it can help the government. The areas where they are operating can now be lifted for quarantine, and I think they are actually discussing this with the government.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We have a follow-up question from Vic Ilag. So based on the biology of the virus, it seems that it is being transmitted from the mouth or nasopharyngeal area. Would mitigation strategies based on reducing viral load in these areas be more effective than social distancing? So recent data from from New York shows that most of the infections are happening at home, where presumably social distancing is not practiced or exempted.
Yes, I think that most probably you have a better information than me. But my intuition is yes, of course. If we wear face masks, etc., I think that will be more effective than social distancing. Because again, sneezing can project something up to uh, 200 feet, and constant breathing without mask or anything can cause this virus to accumulate in the air, especially if you are in a confined area like buses or MRT or even grocery stores. It can accumulate in the air, and since the result indicates that it can stay in the air for maybe 8 hours, dependent on the temperature and humidity. I think yes, preventing it from actually getting out of your body in the first place will be more effective.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Another question from MLC. So there are congested areas like sitios, poor sections of the NCR, and squatter areas. So for such areas, these are not tracked and the report tracked or reported very well. So in fact, the sicknesses are typically hidden deliberately out of fear. Is it possible to account for these situations in the model and see the effect on the area itself as they go out in the areas beyond them?
Uh, Short answer is yes. Typically, almost everything can be accounted by the model. And we have another, I mean, maybe in another webinar, we can discuss some of our models which we have done agent-based modeling, which is more granular. So all of this can be accounted by the model, but the question is whether we can get proper information on these areas. So the example that I mentioned, I watched the YouTube of Dr. Padilla, which is very informative, is the one that they have done in Tondo and in Sampaloc. And if we can allocate 10,000 test kits to do national sampling, which that means a confidence interval of maybe 1 point something percent, then probably we will have a better idea of how this virus is proceeding. When I say sampling, it's the same way that SWS is doing their survey. And the short answer is survey, as you know, was able to take into account the sentiment of everyone, including that of the marginalized sector. And maybe this is something that we can also do. No, we can also do. Once we have that result, and once we have classified that indeed those belonging to class E and class D, they have more cases, then we can therefore ascertain the things that you're saying. But I will not be surprised for such. But okay, I look at one set of data that was given to me by one of the multinationals in the country, the SM group of Greg Domingo. Unfortunately, I don't think I can share the results that they've got. They have a very good analytics team. One thing that I observed there, and they've shown, is that the GDP per capita measure counterintuitively is inversely proportional to the number of deaths and confirmed cases reported globally. Okay, globally. So this is counterintuitive in a sense that the poorer countries actually have less confirmed cases or less deaths. And the reason can vary significantly, of course. Maybe this is just a case of underreporting, but or maybe it is because those with poorer countries with lesser GDP capita impose a more stringent quarantine measures. But it is also possible, and I think there are many who are speculating on this, that those coming from poorer countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, with a GDP capita of merely 3,000 USD, Vietnam has 2,500 USD, we've been exposed to many viruses and bacteria, and which probably could mean that we have developed already some level of antibodies better than our counterpart with a higher GDP per capita. And I think that is a plausible explanation too, because again, I go back to the idea of what we observed in Sampaloc and Tondo, and I think there could be it can be an interesting thing. It can be an interesting case. 6% of the 109 population, if the value that is being reported is right, it translates to 7.5 million infected individuals nationwide, assuming that Sampaloc and Tondo is a representative of the Philippines. But the mere fact that we are reporting deaths that are still, I think, less than 1,000 as of the moment, it can mean that we can survive this virus, which is a good. It's a good news. It's a good news because maybe we can easily have a community quarantine eventually way faster than what we thought of. But my reason why I think we have to continue to be not complacent on this issue is because of the experience from the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu second wave, and the second wave apparently there is a different and a mutated set of virus.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Maybe we'll take last two questions because of time
Okay,
constraints. Okay.
Sorry. Oh, it's already 10.
Yeah. It's we're almost going to 2 hours. So one question is from Ivan Solitario. Are there existing models in the Philippine context that have incorporated heterogeneous contact rates? Can we get an a priori sense of how homogeneous versus heterogeneous estimates would differ?
Actually, in this, I have an initial result here. Okay, where I think the proper estimate for K will be from 0.25 to 0.35. Okay, but the group of Jomar Rubahante, UP Los Baños, they are actually calculating the value of K that is critical for you to be able to understand the level of heterogeneity. And I think that it has some dependency on the density of a specific area, and that is the first approximation. But what is not included, I think, in their model is the road network, etc., etc. But yes, Ibin, you may want to talk to the group of Jomar Rubahante, So Jomar actually, he mentioned to me that he previously worked on parasite dynamics where this idea of K is being used. K is a parameter known as dispersion parameter that looks at the level of heterogeneity, and they have municipal level data to approximate this value. We want to discuss this with him. But the impact of this heterogeneity essentially is simply to, as you will see here, uh, the homogeneous case in general is the worst case scenario. So if we can address the worst case scenario, then chances are we are in a better position. And this is the more conservative, the more conservative case. But of course, if our goal is to relax some of this stringent scenario that we impose on before we can lift the quarantine, then it makes sense to look at the level of heterogeneity, as you mentioned.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Yeah, we'll have the last questions. For those that I wasn't able to ask your question, I hope Chris can address them there in our chat
Yeah, I will be
box.
happy to.
So it would be good, I think, to end with what Giselle has for you. So she wanted to ask, what are your engagements now, perhaps with companies and the governments? Have you engaged with them on? Have you given them any advice on how they should be producing essential food commodities, to sell, how should they self-organize, to invest in resources, and to get essential ground workers back to work and ensure their safety? Essentially, what is your current work with companies with regards to estimating on investment?
Uh, well, um, well, hmm, in general, I think my most important contribution, at least at this point in time, is to link different individuals together. Like for example, the ventilators that is being developed by the group of Unilab. Now they are developing this in collaboration with the guys from LaSalle, Professor. I forgot I keep on forgetting the names. Uh, but overall, and yes, we had a discussions with the team of Carl Chua, NEDA, because we've been working with them even prior to this pandemic. But I can only provide my perspective. But at the end of the day, I think there are other things that I have not privy to. No? So overall, I needless to say, we have seen the contribution of the different companies during this time on the different initiatives. And one thing that I'm quite excited about actually now is that most companies, the different companies that we've been engaging in, are looking to conduct their own sample testing, some surveys on the different areas where they are operating, and they are engaging us to help them interpret the results that they are getting. But I feel that this is something that the government can actually do. 10,000 samples, uh, five different times, okay, and unbiased, because most of the companies, they are really focusing on the areas where most of their employees are located and where their companies are located. And then the way it is happening now is once they have that result, they go directly to IATF, they go directly to the different institutions who are putting up the policies to bargain on whether they can open or not open the economy. But if the government can do this on a bigger scale, then that will be better. So again, I guess my contribution is minimal in many ways. And one of the hope why I have accepted this webinar in PAASE is essentially twofold. One is to encourage the modelers, and again, I will be very happy to share the slides that these slides and all the notebooks that we've created to better improve the modeling process. And secondly, and this is probably my last note, since that is the last question, I realize now more than any time how critical it is to have world-class scientists in the Philippines. When you have an issue that must be addressed with a local context, but with the ability to generalize it to the global context, it is important that you have world-class scientists here who are confident in understanding the science and in giving perspective, uh, that it is not a mere copycat of the perspective of the other groups. We need that level of we need that level of confidence. So one reason why, in fact, I look at this epidemic modeling, bridging the different gaps of the epidemic modeling, is because I realized that even some of the more cited individuals in NASA, in NYU, etc., they are committing elementary mistakes with respect to their understanding of the exponential curves and the logistic curves, that being a representative of the epidemic models. And one of the article was in fact very famous, when in fact the only reason for the failure of understanding here is failure to understand the basic mathematics. So, but again, the significance or the importance of having scientists who are confident about their ability to understand a certain scenario or certain system will mean that you will probably have a more optimal solution or more optimal weather for your local condition. Philippines in general are not being captured in terms of modeling effort compared to other countries, and you can see that the one that has been distributed significantly as a result of the modeling from other countries is that of the Singapore's SUPD. And for all intent and purposes, we know that it is a big the approximation is wrong.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Before we
Thank
close
you.
the session, I just want to share to everybody our session for next week. So next week, we
Thank
will
you, Chris.
be shifting gears a bit. We will leave COVID-19 issues for a while, and we will be discussing something also very important, and I think something very close to everyone. So we'll discuss the evolutionary origins and spread of rice. So our speaker for next meeting would be Professor Michael Puruganan of New York University. So I hope you guys can join us again. So it's again on Friday, 8 to 9 a.m. for the Philippines. If you're interested, please register at bit.ly/mpuruganan. And again, for all the activities of PAASE, you can look us up on Facebook. We also have our own website, which is paase.org. And all the webinars that we are conducting will be uploaded in our YouTube channel. So that's bit.ly/paase webinars.